The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Isaiah Granger would later say was the best thing that had ever happened to a Tuesday in the entire history of the Arizona Territory. He had been standing at the post office counter in Redemption Creek, a town so small it barely deserved the name, when old Hattie Drummond pushed the envelope across the wooden surface with a look on her face that suggested she knew something worth knowing. Hattie always had that look. She ran the post office out of the front room of her home, and she claimed she never read other people's correspondence, which everyone in town understood to be an extraordinary lie told by an otherwise honest woman. Isaiah took the envelope and turned it over in his calloused hands. The handwriting on the front was careful and deliberate, each letter formed with the kind of patience that suggested the writer had thought hard before committing ink to paper. It was addressed to him in full. Isaiah Granger, Redemption Creek, Arizona Territory. He did not recognize the return name. Effie Carver, Missouri. He tucked the letter into the breast pocket of his canvas work shirt, thanked Hattie with a tip of his hat, and walked the half-mile back to his homestead with the envelope pressing warm against his chest, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. The homestead was modest by any measure and grand by none. A two-room cabin built from pine timber he had felled himself, a barn that listed slightly to the left after a windstorm 3 years prior, a vegetable garden that produced more stubbornness than actual vegetables, and 40 acres of dry scrub land that he was slowly coaxing into something resembling a working cattle operation. He had 12 head of cattle, 2 horses, a dog named Biscuit who was neither young nor particularly useful, and a neighbor named Colt Hadley who lived 3 miles east and came over every Sunday to play cards and eat whatever Isaiah had managed to cook. Isaiah had come to Arizona in 1882, 7 years ago now, following the death of his wife, Clara, who had been taken by fever 2 weeks after their only child, a son named Thomas, had been stillborn. He had left Kansas because Kansas held too much of what he had lost, and Arizona held enough empty space that a man could breathe without accidentally inhaling grief. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, weathered in the particular way that outdoor men become weathered in their 30s, and he had long since made his peace with the idea that companionship was not a thing he was likely to find again in Redemption Creek. He had not written to a matrimonial agency. He wanted to be clear about that in his own mind as he sat down at the table inside his cabin and opened the letter. He had told Colt Hadley, in what he had believed to be a private conversation, that he sometimes thought about how it might be nice to have someone to talk to in the evenings. Colt, being Colt, had apparently taken that as a mandate and submitted Isaiah's name and a brief description of his circumstances to a correspondence agency in Kansas City that matched prospective wives with prospective husbands across the Western Territories. Isaiah had only learned about this 2 months ago when the first inquiry arrived, which he had read 3 times, and then set aside while he gathered his feelings about being submitted to a matrimonial service without his knowledge or consent. He had written back. He was not entirely sure why. Perhaps because the letter had been written by someone who clearly chose words the way a careful cook chose ingredients, with intention and without waste. Perhaps because Redemption Creek in the evenings had grown very quiet. Perhaps because he was 34 and the silence had weight. He unfolded the letter now. Dear Mr. Granger, it began, I promised myself I would be honest with you, and so I will be honest with you even when honesty is not flattering to me personally. You asked in your last letter what I look like, and I have been sitting with that question for 11 days now, which is 11 days longer than it deserves. I am 31 years old. I am plain. There is no other word that serves better, so I will not dress it up in language meant to soften the truth. My hair is brown, my eyes are gray, and my face is the kind of face that is easy to look past in a crowd. I am not fashionable in the way women in larger cities are fashionable, and I do not expect to become so. I have strong hands because I have worked hard my whole life, and I have a quick temper that I work harder to govern than almost anything else. I know how to bake bread and set fence posts and read Latin, though I confess I cannot think of a single occasion in recent memory when Latin has been required. I am not young in the way that might make a man feel he has his choice of companions. I tell you these things not to dissuade you, but because if you are to want me, I would rather you want the true version of me and not the one I might have invented to seem more appealing. With that said, I understand entirely if you do not write back. Yours sincerely, Effie Carver. Isaiah read the letter through twice, and then a third time, and then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of his cabin for a long while. He did not think the letter was meant to dissuade him. He thought, actually, that it was the most compelling thing anyone had said to him in several years. Because what Effie Carver had done, with her careful words and her honest inventory of herself, was describe a person so precisely real that he could almost picture her sitting across from him. No artifice, no performance, just a woman with strong hands and gray eyes and a quick temper she worked to govern. He had known women who worked to govern their tempers. His mother had been such a woman. He had liked that about her enormously. He wrote back the same evening. He filled 3 pages. He told her that plain was not a thing he had ever set much store by, that he had buried a wife who most people in Kansas had called beautiful, and the beauty had not kept either of them warm against grief. He told her he had strong hands too and a temper he was less successful at governing than she appeared to be. He told her that Redemption Creek was not much, but that the sunsets over the desert were the kind of thing a man would be a fool to take for granted, and that if she ever wanted to see one, she was welcome. He sent the letter before he could think better of it. 3 weeks passed. He tended his cattle and repaired the fence along the north pasture and played cards with Colt on Sundays, and did not mention the letters because he had not yet forgiven Colt for submitting his name to the agency in the first place, though he found himself forgiving Colt a little more with each passing day. The second letter arrived on a Wednesday. Hattie Drummond was smiling when she handed it to him. It was the kind of smile that suggested she had been practicing it since the letter arrived and had it ready. Isaiah carried the letter home and opened it at the table. "Dear Mr. Granger," it said, "I have read your letter many more times than is reasonable. You are either an honest man or a very talented liar, and I have decided to believe you are honest because the alternative is uncomfortable. I am writing to tell you that I am coming. I have purchased a train ticket to Tucson, and from there I intend to arrange passage to Redemption Creek, however one arranges such things in Arizona. I will arrive in approximately 3 weeks from the date of this letter. I want to be clear that I am not coming because I am desperate, though I recognize that a 31-year-old unmarried woman making her way to Arizona territory on the basis of 2 letters might appear desperate to outside observers. I am coming because you wrote 3 pages and they were all good pages, and in my experience, good pages are rarer than desperate circumstances. I would ask that you not meet me at the station with inflated expectations. I am exactly as I described. Yours, Effie Carver. P.S. I also cannot govern my temper when I am very tired, so if I am sharp upon arrival, please do not hold it against me permanently." Isaiah set the letter down on the table very carefully as though it were something breakable. Then he laughed. It came out of him unexpectedly, like something that had been stored under pressure, a real laugh, the kind that used his whole chest, and Biscuit lifted his gray muzzle from the floor and looked at him with the mild concern of an old dog unaccustomed to happiness. He had 3 weeks to prepare. He began the next morning. The cabin needed work. He had been meaning to add a second window to the main room for 2 years, and had never done it because there was no particular reason to. And now there was a reason, and he drove the window frame in before noon and spent the afternoon fitting glass. He traded a saddle blanket to get from the general store. He built a proper shelf above the stove for storing things, because there had never been a shelf there before and he had never missed one. but he thought a woman who baked bread might appreciate a place to put things. He scrubbed the floors with lye soap and fought a losing battle with the soot above the fireplace, and eventually decided the soot was part of the cabin's character and would simply have to be accepted. Colt Hadley came on Sunday and noticed immediately that something had changed. "You cleaned," Colt said, standing in the doorway with the kind of expression a man wears when he has stumbled onto information he was not expecting. "I clean," Isaiah said. "You have never once cleaned in the 7 years I have known you. Sit down and deal the cards, Colt." Colt sat down. He dealt the cards. He looked around the room again at the new window and the shelf above the stove and the floor that had been scrubbed to a color lighter than he remembered it. "Someone's coming," Colt said. "Deal the cards." "The woman from Missouri." Isaiah looked at him over the top of his hand. "I said deal the cards." "I knew it would work," Colt said, with the deeply satisfied expression of a man who had done something without permission and turned out to be right. "You were getting grim, Isaiah." "A man gets grim when he's been alone too long. I did you a service. You submitted my name to a matrimonial agency without asking me, and now someone is coming." "She hasn't arrived yet," Isaiah said, though he was aware that this argument was not the strong ground he wanted it to be. "She might take one look at this place and turn straight back around." "What's her name?" A pause. "Effie Carver." "Effie," Colt said, turning the name over. "That's a good name. Deal the cards, Colt." The 3 weeks moved at the pace of a reluctant river. Isaiah finished the repairs on the cabin, planted extra seeds in the vegetable garden because it seemed like the kind of thing a person who was expecting company ought to do, and spent 2 evenings working on a letter he ultimately did not send because everything he wrote sounded either too eager or too restrained, and he could not find the middle ground. He had been straightforward in his first 2 letters, and he would be straightforward in person. That was the only plan he could commit to. He drove the wagon to Tucson on the morning her train was due. The drive took 4 hours on roads that were less roads than suggestions, the kind of dry, rutted tracks through desert scrub that a horse learned to navigate by instinct. The mountains to the south were purple in the early morning and turned brown by noon, and the saguaro cactus stood along the ridgelines like tall, thin sentinels with their arms raised. Isaiah had stopped noticing this landscape long ago the way a man stops noticing the face of a person he sees every day. But he noticed it that morning because he was thinking about what it would look like to someone seeing it for the first time. The Tucson train station was a low adobe building with a wooden platform and a great deal of dust. It was 1889, and the Southern Pacific had been running through Tucson for 8 years, and the town had grown considerably around it into something that looked almost like a real city if you stood in the right spot and did not look too far in any direction. Isaiah tied his horses to the post outside the station and went inside. The train was 20 minutes late, which gave him time to sit on a bench and observe the other people waiting, and to become aware that his hat was on slightly crooked, and to straighten it twice without achieving any particular improvement. He had worn his good shirt, a blue one his mother had sent from Kansas 2 Christmases ago that he had never found an occasion to wear. It felt formal in a way that made him self-conscious. He almost wished he had worn the canvas work shirt, which was honest about what kind of man he was. The train arrived with the theatrical noise that trains always arrived with, steam and the grinding of brakes, and the slow accumulation of sound becoming motion becoming stillness. People descended from the cars with the variety of purpose that characterized train platforms in the West. Families with children, men in business clothes who belonged to the railroad or the territorial government, cowboys heading back to ranches, a group of miners with the particular dusty exhaustion that distinguished men who worked underground. Isaiah stood near the platform gate and watched the crowd thin. He had not told her what he looked like either. He had described the wagon and the 2 horses, and said he would be the one standing near the gate with a hat that needed better breaking in. He had not told her he was 34, or broad-shouldered, or that his hair had gone gray at the temples in the last 2 years in a way that he had not especially asked for. He almost missed her. She stepped off the last car carrying a brown leather satchel and a carpet bag that was clearly very heavy by the way she held her shoulder, and she stood on the platform for a moment and looked around with the composed expression of someone who was determined not to appear lost even if they were. She was not tall. She wore a gray traveling dress that was practical rather than decorative and a hat that matched the practicality of everything else about her. Her hair was dark brown, pinned up neatly under the hat. Her face was exactly as she had described it. It was a plain face in the sense that it wore no pretension, no performance, no careful arrangement of features designed to catch a particular kind of light. It was a face that looked out at the world directly. She was looking directly at him when their eyes met across the platform. He saw the moment she recognized the wagon and the horses and made the calculation that he was the man attached to them. He saw her chin lift, very slightly, in the way that a person lifts their chin when they have decided to walk straight into something rather than sideways around it. He walked toward her, and she walked toward him, and they met in the middle of the platform. "Mr. Granger," she said. Her voice was clear and carried the slight crispness of someone who had a habit of meaning exactly what they said. "Miss Carver," he said, "welcome to Arizona." She looked at him with the gray eyes that were exactly as advertised, and he saw in them the same careful assessment that he was making of her, the same honest accounting. She was taking inventory of him the way she had taken inventory of herself in her letter, without sentiment but without cruelty. "You are taller than I expected," she said. "You said not to have inflated expectations," he said. "I should have said the same." Something in her expression shifted. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one, the kind of expression that a smile makes just before it decides to appear. "I'm exactly as I said," she said. "I want to be sure you understand that before we go any further." "You are," he said, "and I find I don't mind at all." She looked at him a moment longer, and then she looked at the carpet bag in her hand and then at the wagon, and the almost smile became an actual one. Small but genuine. It went all the way to her eyes. "Then I suppose," she said, "I had better see this sunset you promised me." He took the carpet bag from her before she could argue with him about it and led her to the wagon, and she climbed up onto the bench without assistance and without comment, which told him something useful about the kind of woman she was, and they drove out of Tucson into the enormous Arizona afternoon. They talked for the first hour about practical things. He told her about the homestead, the cabin, the cattle, the vegetable garden that was more intention than production. She told him about Missouri, about the small town she had come from called Grafton, about the schoolhouse where she had taught children for 8 years, about the sister who had married well and the parents who had died within 6 months of each other when Effie was 26, which had left her alone in a way that went beyond simply being unmarried. "I liked teaching," she said. "I did not like that a woman teaching school in Missouri is expected to be unmarried, and that the moment she marries, she is expected to stop teaching." "You would not have to stop here," he said. "There is a schoolhouse in Redemption Creek. Mrs. Alderman has been teaching the children there for 40 years, and she is looking to retire." Effie turned and looked at him with an expression that suggested this piece of information was significant to her in a way she had not anticipated. "You looked into that," she said. "I asked around," he said. "I thought it might matter to you." She was quiet for a moment. "You thought about what might matter to me." "I tried to," he said. She looked back at the road ahead. The desert spread in every direction, pale gold in the afternoon light, the saguaro casting long shadows that reached across the rocky ground. "My sister told me this was foolish," she said. "Coming here on the basis of 2 letters. Was she wrong?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said, and the honesty of it was so complete that he felt something in his chest settle into a new position, like a stone finding its place in a wall. "That's fair," he said. "Your neighbor," she said, "the one who submitted your name to the agency, is he a good man?" "He's an interfering man," Isaiah said, "but he is a good one, yes." "Good," she said. "Interfering can be forgiven in a good man." The sun was low by the time they arrived at Redemption Creek, and as they came over the slight rise before the town, the sky to the west was doing what Arizona skies do in the last hour of daylight, turning colors that had no precise names. A deep burning orange at the horizon, and above it rose, and above that a violet that faded upward into the soft darkening blue of the coming night. Isaiah had not staged this. It was simply what the sky did, and he was aware as he watched Effie see it for the first time that some coincidences are a form of grace. She did not say anything for a moment. She just looked. "Oh," she said quietly. "Yes," he agreed. They sat in the wagon on the rise above the town for a full minute before he clicked the horses forward, and Effie Carver watched the sunset over the Arizona desert with her hands folded in her lap, and an expression on her face that he would spend a long time afterward trying to accurately remember. Redemption Creek had 214 residents in 1889, and the arrival of a new woman was the kind of event that the town treated as community news. Hattie Drummond had apparently already told everyone that a woman from Missouri was coming to stay at the Granger homestead on the basis of a matrimonial correspondence, and so when Isaiah drove the wagon down Main Street with Effie sitting beside him, there was an unusual number of people engaged in activities that required them to be on the front porches of the various establishments along the main road. Effie noticed. "They are all looking at us," she said, without turning her head. "They are," he agreed. "Is this a small town?" "Very small." "Good," she said. "I know how small towns work." She straightened her spine by what appeared to be approximately 1 additional inch, and lifted her chin, and nodded pleasantly in the general direction of the storefronts as they passed. And Isaiah watched 2 women he recognized from the church congregation nudge each other with an expression that could only be described as hopeful approval. Effie did not look desperate or uncertain. She looked like a woman who had decided to do a thing and had done it, which was a different quality entirely, and one that small western towns respected. He had arranged with Mrs. Alderman, the teacher, for Effie to stay in the old schoolhouse back room while the question of propriety was still open. It would not have been appropriate for her to stay in the cabin with him until things were properly settled, and Isaiah had recognized this before Effie could point it out to him. He drove her to the schoolhouse first. Mrs. Alderman was 81 years old and had the spare, economical bearing of someone who had been telling children what to do for 4 decades and saw no particular reason to stop. She met them on the schoolhouse steps and looked Effie over with the frank assessment of a woman who had long since given up the pretense of social nicety. "Missouri," Mrs. Alderman said. "What did you teach?" "Reading, arithmetic, history, and some geography," Effie said. "Also Latin, though I found it generally useful only to me." Mrs. Alderman's eyes narrowed with something that turned out, upon closer inspection, to be satisfaction. "Granger tells me you might be interested in taking over when I retire." "I might be," Effie said, "if the situation warrants." Mrs. Alderman looked at Isaiah. "She'll do," she said, in the tone of someone delivering a final verdict. Then she opened the schoolhouse door and led them inside to show Effie the back room. Isaiah left her there with her carpet bag and her satchel, and drove back to his homestead in the dark. Biscuit came to meet him at the barn door, and he scratched the old dog's ears and stood in the yard for a while, looking at the stars. Arizona stars were another thing a man eventually stopped seeing, and he was seeing them again. The following morning he arrived at the schoolhouse at 7, which was earlier than any reasonable social call warranted, with a basket that contained biscuits he had cooked himself, and a jar of honey from Redemption Creek's only beekeeper, a man named Patel who had come from India 15 years ago and built something extraordinary in the desert, and whose honey was considered the finest in the territory. Effie was already outside when he arrived, sitting on the schoolhouse steps with a book in her lap, apparently having been awake for some time. She was wearing a simpler dress than yesterday, a darker blue, and her hair was not yet pinned but braided and hanging over one shoulder, and she looked entirely different from the composed woman he had collected from the train platform, softer somehow, more herself. She looked up when he approached and then at the basket. "You cooked," she said. "I did." "Are they good?" "That depends," he said, sitting down on the step below hers and setting the basket between them, "on what you think a biscuit should be." She took one and bit into it and chewed thoughtfully, with the precise, evaluative expression of someone running a considered assessment. "Not bad," she said. "High praise." "I don't give praise I don't mean," she said, and then she added, "They are actually quite good. Better than quite good." He smiled, and she noticed and looked away, and he noticed her noticing and looked away too, and it was the kind of small moment that becomes a cornerstone without anyone planning for it. He took her on a tour of Redemption Creek that morning. The general store, run by a man named Abe Torres and his wife Rosa, who were warm and immediately welcoming because Rosa was from New Mexico and had also come to this part of Arizona without knowing precisely what she was getting into, and felt a kinship with anyone making a similar journey. The blacksmith, Walt Greer, who was a man of so few words that a conversation with him was essentially a monologue. The small church presided over by Reverend Adams, who was young for a reverend and nervous about it in the endearing way that people are nervous about responsibilities they take seriously. The creek itself, which was more of a trickle in August but which ran genuinely in the spring and gave the town its name. Hattie Drummond's post office, where Hattie was barely pretending to sort mail and was instead watching them through the window with unconcealed interest. "She's watching us," Effie said as they walked past. "She watches everyone," Isaiah said. "She knows everything about everyone in this town." "Does that bother you?" "It used to. Now I think of it as a local weather service." "If you want to know what's happening, you check with Hattie," Effie laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it was better than he had been hoping for, unguarded and genuine, a laugh that came from somewhere real. She covered her mouth with one hand in the habitual way of someone who had been taught that laughing loudly was unladylike, and had not entirely succeeded in unlearning the instinct. Colt Hadley materialized at noon, as though he had been waiting at a predetermined location. He came riding up Main Street on his big roan horse with an expression of casual nonchalance, so overperformed that it communicated, to anyone who knew him, that he had been watching for this opportunity since dawn. He swung down from the horse and removed his hat with a sweeping gesture that was more theatrical than necessary. "Miss Carver," he said, "Colt Hadley, it is a genuine pleasure." Effie regarded him with a measured expression. "You are the one who submitted Mr. Granger's name without asking him." Colt's theatrical confidence flickered. He glanced at Isaiah. "He told you that." "He did, immediately." "Ah," said Colt. "It was presumptuous," Effie said. Then, after a pause that she allowed to run a little long, "and it may have turned out to be a reasonable thing to do. I have not yet decided." Colt recovered his equilibrium. "That's a fair position," he said. "I generally find fair positions more useful than fixed ones," she said. "It is nice to meet you, Mr. Hadley." Colt replaced his hat and looked at Isaiah over Effie's head with an expression that conveyed, without words, that he approved enormously of this woman and was very pleased with himself for setting events in motion that had led to her arrival. Isaiah gave him the look of a man who had not entirely forgiven him, but was no longer putting energy into the effort. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt, even at the time, like something being built toward permanence. Isaiah drove to the schoolhouse in the mornings. Sometimes they walked. He showed her the homestead, walking her through the cabin and out to the barn, and along the fence lines of the pasture while the 12 cattle looked on with the incurious gaze of animals who had decided nothing was likely to alarm them. She asked practical questions about the operation, not politely but genuinely, because she wanted to understand how the thing worked. "The garden," she said, crouching beside the struggling vegetable beds along the south wall of the cabin, "is not being watered correctly." "I water it." "You are watering it too much along the edges and not enough at the roots," she said. "And you have planted the tomatoes too close together. They are competing." "I'm aware the garden is a weak point," he said. "I could fix it," she said. She was looking at the plants with the appraising eye of someone who saw a problem clearly and had an idea about the solution. "You are welcome to," he said. She stood up and brushed the dirt from her hands and looked at the cabin with the same appraising eye she had just turned on the garden. "The window you added is good," she said. "I added it before you arrived." "I know," she said. She looked at him. "You built a shelf above the stove. Bread needs somewhere to cool." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the cabin with the afternoon light on it, the desert stretching behind it, the mountains hazy purple in the distance. He watched her look at it and tried to see it as she was seeing it, this small, imperfect, hardworking homestead on the edge of the Arizona territory, and he thought that what she was looking at was not the thing itself but the possibility of it. "Isaiah," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. She did not seem to notice she had done it. He noticed. "Yes," he said. "Tell me about your wife," she said. "Clara." He had not expected this. He had talked around it in his letters, mentioned her loss without dwelling on it, the way a man mentions a wound that has healed but left a mark. He was quiet for a moment. "She was kind," he said. "Genuinely kind, the kind that isn't an effort." She laughed easily. "She was a beautiful woman and she knew it but didn't make a thing of it." He paused. "We had 2 years together before she got sick. They were good years. I would not take them back to have been spared the grief because that seems like the wrong calculation." Effie looked at him steadily through this. "The child," she said. "Born still," he said. "A boy, we would have named him Thomas." "I'm sorry," she said, and the 2 words were so direct and unornamental that they carried more weight than a longer expression of sympathy would have. "You never married," he said. It was a statement, but she heard the question in it. "There was a man," she said, "when I was 23, a schoolteacher in Grafton named Robert Marsh. We were engaged. He died of typhoid before we were married." "I'm sorry," he said, giving her the same directness back. "I was very sad for a long time," she said. "And then I was not as sad. And then I decided that I was not going to sit in Grafton and wait for a life that was going to arrange itself around a fixed set of expectations about what women of a certain age were allowed to want." She looked at the desert again. "And then your neighbor submitted your name to an agency. And now you are here," he said. "And now I am here," she agreed. They looked at each other in the afternoon light. 2 people carrying the particular weight of the life they had lived before arriving at this point. And there was between them something that was not yet love, but was the honest foundation on which love, if it came, would stand without shifting. 3 days after that, the problem of Delbert Cross arrived. Delbert Cross was not a bad man exactly. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county, the Cross Bar Ranch, which sat 12 miles north of Redemption Creek and employed a rotating crew of cowboys and did a considerable business selling beef to the mining operations south of Tucson. He was 52 years old, had been married twice and widowed twice, and had a son named Miles who was 22 and spent most of his time in Tucson spending the money his father made. Delbert Cross had also, apparently, been conducting a quiet negotiation with Walt Greer about the purchase of 8 acres of Isaiah's eastern pasture that bordered Cross Bar land. A negotiation Isaiah had been unaware of and had declined firmly when it was first raised 6 months ago. The reason this became immediately relevant was that Delbert Cross rode into town on a Thursday morning and walked into the general store while Isaiah and Effie were inside purchasing flour and sugar and a good tin of coffee, and he stopped when he saw Effie with the same expression a man makes when he has seen something he immediately decides he wants. Isaiah watched him make that expression. "Granger," Cross said, with the perfunctory acknowledgement of a powerful man addressing a smaller one. Then his eyes went back to Effie. "And who is this?" "Miss Effie Carver," Isaiah said. "She is staying in Redemption Creek." "Carver," Cross said, and he removed his hat with a gesture that was entirely different from the one Colt had used, calculated rather than genuine. "It is a very great pleasure." Effie looked at him with the flat, steady gaze of a woman who had taken stock of a situation and reached a preliminary conclusion. "Mr. Cross," she said. Cross turned to rows of tours behind the counter and ordered something, then turned back to them with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to occupying more than his share of a room. "You've come a long way, Miss Carver," he said. "Missouri, is it? That's quite a journey for a lady." "I found it manageable," Effie said. "Are you planning to stay long?" "That depends on a number of things," she said. Cross smiled, the kind of smile that had gotten him things he wanted for a long time and knew it. "Well, Redemption Creek is a fine place. A woman needs support out here, though. Someone established. Someone who knows the land." His eyes moved briefly to Isaiah and away again, and the dismissal in them was so practiced it was almost invisible. Isaiah felt the particular cold clarity of a man who has been underestimated so many times he has stopped being surprised by it, but who has also never, not once, decided to accept it. "Miss Carver has more support than she requires," Isaiah said. His voice was even, the way a plank of good wood is even, flat and firm all the way through. Cross looked at him with a slight recalibration of expression. "Of course," he said pleasantly. "Of course she does." He tipped his hat to Effie. "Miss Carver, I hope we'll see more of each other." "One never knows," Effie said, with a pleasantness so precise it was a complete deflection. When Cross had gone, Abe Torres looked at Isaiah from behind the counter with an expression that communicated very clearly that he had seen what had just happened and thought Isaiah had handled it correctly. Outside on the boardwalk, Effie walked beside Isaiah in the direction of the schoolhouse and said nothing for a full block. "He wants your land," she said eventually. "The eastern pasture." "Yes. And now he also wants to present himself as a better prospect than you." Isaiah glanced at her. She was looking straight ahead. "That is not a difficult competition," he said. She stopped walking. He stopped with her. She turned and looked at him directly. "Do not say things like that," she said, and her tone had the particular quality he had read about in her letter, the quick temper being governed but not entirely concealed. "Do not diminish yourself." A man who built a homestead from nothing in the Arizona desert and taught himself to cook, and added a window to his cabin before a woman he had never met arrived from Missouri, is not someone who should stand next to Delbert Cross and call the comparison unfavorable. "Do you understand me?" He looked at her. The morning light was on her face, and she was looking at him with gray eyes that held something fierce and certain, and he thought, with the particular clarity of a man whose understanding of himself has just been quietly rearranged, that he could not have written 3 pages good enough to deserve this. "I understand you," he said. "Good," she said, and started walking again. Then, after a moment, "Also, his boots are too expensive for a man working cattle. He doesn't actually work his own land." Isaiah walked beside her and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Effie, yes, I'm glad you came." She was quiet. They walked the last half block to the schoolhouse in the morning quiet of Redemption Creek, and when they reached the steps she stopped and looked at him with an expression he could not have named precisely, something that was being decided and had not yet finished deciding. "So am I," she said. "I think. Yes, I believe I am." Mrs. Alderman appeared in the schoolhouse doorway at that moment with the magnificent timing of a woman who had lived 81 years and understood that the young needed nudging. "Miss Carver," she said, "come see the curriculum I've been using. I suspect you'll have opinions about it." "I almost certainly will," Effie said and went inside. Isaiah stood on the schoolhouse steps in the September morning, and the town went about its business around him, and he felt, for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, that the future was a place he wanted to get to. The Sunday cards game that week included Effie, which was Colt's suggestion, delivered with a casualness that fooled absolutely no one. They sat around Isaiah's table and played poker, with a seriousness that escalated gradually over the course of 2 hours, until it became clear that Effie Carver had been playing poker considerably longer than she had let on, and had the kind of poker face that came from years of practicing in a schoolroom where you could never let the children know when they had surprised you. Colt lost 3 hands in a row and looked at Isaiah with an expression that was half accusation and half admiration. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Colt demanded. "My father," Effie said, arranging her winnings on the table with quiet satisfaction. "He thought it was a useful skill. He was right." "She's been hustling us," Colt said to Isaiah. "I've been playing honestly," Effie said. "I simply happen to be better at it than either of you." "She's been hustling us," Colt said again, but he was grinning. Isaiah won the next hand on a genuine good draw, and when he put his cards down on the table, Effie looked at them, and then at him with an expression that was entirely pleased, as though his winning was something she had been hoping for without admitting it. They played until the candles burned low, and when Colt finally rode home into the night, Isaiah and Effie sat at the table for a while in the remaining candlelight, not playing cards, not saying much of anything, just being in the same room in the particular easy quiet of two people who have begun to find each other's company something they do not want to break. "I am going to take over from Mrs. Alderman," Effie said. She said it in the way of something she had been turning over for days and had now committed to. "She is ready to retire. The children need a teacher. I am a teacher." "I'm glad," he said. "That will mean I am staying," she said. She looked at him as she said it, making sure it arrived clearly. "I know," he said. "I want to be clear that I am making that decision for myself," she said. "Not because I feel I have no other option, because I want to." "I know," he said again. "That matters to me. The distinction." She looked at him in the candlelight, and the distinction she had drawn between a woman with choices and a woman without them settled into the space between them and was acknowledged. "There is also," she said very carefully, "the matter of what we are to each other." The candlelight between them was steady. There was no wind that evening. "Yes," he said. "I am not the kind of woman who requires elaborate ceremony," she said. "But I am also not the kind of woman who can exist comfortably in a situation that has not been properly named." "What would you name it?" he asked. She considered this with the precision she applied to everything. "I would name it," she said, "as two people who have been honest with each other across a distance and who are now honest with each other in the same room, and who are, I believe, inclined toward each other in a manner that goes beyond practical arrangement." He looked at her across the table in the last light of the candle. He thought about everything she had written, everything she had said, the way she had stood on that train platform with her chin up, the way she had told him not to diminish himself, the way she had looked at the sunset, the way she laughed with her hand over her mouth, the way she had crouched beside his failing garden and seen immediately what was wrong with it. "I am inclined toward you," he said. "Very much so." Her shoulders dropped about a quarter of an inch, the way a person's shoulders drop when something they have been holding in some suspended uncertainty is resolved. "Then we agree," she said. "We agree," he said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she looked down at their hands together on the table, her strong-fingered practical hand and his calloused work-worn hand, and she did not move hers away. The next weeks rolled forward like something that had been gathering its pace for a long time and was now finding it. Effie took over the classroom from Mrs. Alderman on a Monday, and by Friday the parents of Redemption Creek had already begun to understand that Miss Carver was the kind of teacher who expected children to actually learn things, which was both alarming and deeply reassuring depending on which child was yours. She had strong opinions about arithmetic and stronger ones about history, and she had already begun teaching a girl named Lucia Torres, Abe and Rosa's oldest daughter, the rudiments of Latin on the theory that there was no good reason to keep Latin for oneself. Isaiah drove her to school in the mornings, and she walked home in the afternoons through the town that was becoming, by degrees, hers as much as his. Rosa Torres had taken her firmly under wing. Mrs. Alderman, retired but not in any practical sense removed from the situation, came by the schoolhouse every few days to observe and occasionally to correct, which Effie allowed because Mrs. Alderman had been teaching children to read for 40 years, and there was wisdom in that worth extracting. Delbert Cross appeared in town twice more and twice more managed to position himself in proximity to Effie with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to getting what he set his sights on. Effie managed him both times with the same flat, precise courtesy, and Isaiah managed him with the patience of a man who knew that patience was the card that played best in the long run. On the second occasion, Cross made the mistake of suggesting, in front of Abe Torres and two other men whose names circulated widely in town, that Isaiah's homestead was a modest proposition for a woman of apparent quality, and that a woman like Miss Carver might find the Cross Bar Ranch a more comfortable situation. Isaiah did not say anything immediately. He let the silence run. "Mr. Cross," Effie said, before Isaiah had to, "I have come from Missouri on the basis of what I know of Isaiah Granger's character, and I have found that everything I knew about it was accurate, and more besides. I am not a woman who chooses a situation for its square footage. I will thank you to stop presenting yourself as an alternative, as I have not suggested you were one." There was a silence in Abe Torres' general store that could have been used to hang things on. Cross looked at Isaiah, and Isaiah looked back with the steady, unhurried expression of a man who has said everything he intended to say by saying nothing. Cross left. The four people in the store watched him go. "He won't try again," Abe said. "No," Isaiah agreed. "Not after that," said one of the other men, with the impressed satisfaction of someone who has witnessed a thing done cleanly. Effie straightened the items in her purchasing basket and said, "I need 4 yards of blue muslin if you have it, Abe," and the conversation moved on. Isaiah fell in love with her in the end on an entirely ordinary Wednesday. He had not planned it. He had understood for some time that he was moving in that direction, the way a man walking toward a fire understands gradually that he is going to be warm. But the actual moment of understanding that it had already happened came on a Wednesday evening in October, when he arrived at the schoolhouse to walk her home, and found her inside after hours with a small boy, 7 years old, named Sam Whitmore, whose father had a farm on the western edge of the county and whose mother was dead. Sam Whitmore was crying the hopeless, silent way a child cries when they have been crying for a long time and have exhausted the more dramatic phases of it. He was sitting in a desk chair, and Effie was crouched beside him, not touching him, just being present at his level, talking to him in a low, steady voice. Isaiah stood in the doorway and did not interrupt. "I know," Effie was saying. "I know it is very hard, and there is nothing wrong with you for finding it hard. You are not weak for missing her. Missing someone you love is not a weakness, Sam. It is the proof of something real." The boy wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked at her. "Does it stop?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. She was not going to lie to him. Isaiah could see her choosing not to lie. "It changes," she said. "It does not stop, but it changes. It becomes something you carry differently, and eventually it sits more lightly, and you can still carry it and also carry other things at the same time." Sam thought about this. "Did someone go away for you?" "Yes," she said, "more than one someone." "And do you carry it differently now?" "I am getting there," she said. "I am still practicing." Isaiah stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse in the October evening, and he had no defense against what he was feeling, and he did not try to find one. He loved this woman. He loved her honesty with a 7-year-old boy about grief. He loved that she had told the truth when the truth was harder to say than a comfortable reassurance. He loved her gray eyes and her plain face and the quality of her attention when she turned it on something she cared about. He waited in the doorway until the boy had gathered himself and collected his things and gone home, and then Effie stood up and turned and saw him there, and he was not sure what was on his face, but it must have been something, because she looked at him carefully. "How long have you been standing there?" she asked. "Long enough," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she came toward the door and stopped in front of him and looked up at him with the direct, undeflected gaze that was, he had come to understand, the most characteristic thing about her. He cupped her face in both his hands, those calloused, work-worn hands, and she let him, and he kissed her. She kissed him back with the same absence of performance that characterized everything else she did, fully and honestly and without reservation. When they stepped apart, she was looking at him with gray eyes that were very bright. "Good," she said, which was not the most romantic thing anyone had ever said in this precise situation, but which was, coming from Effie Carver, exactly right. He laughed and she laughed, and this time she did not cover her mouth. He proposed to her on a Sunday in November when the desert had gone cool, and the sky was a hard, brilliant blue that belonged only to autumn in Arizona. He did not do it with elaborate preparation or performed ceremony, because those things did not fit either of them. They were walking along the creek, which was running better now that the season had turned, and he stopped and turned to her and said simply that he wanted to marry her, not because it made sense logistically or because they had come to an understanding that pointed in that direction, but because he loved her and could not imagine the homestead, the mornings, the sunsets, the card games, the quiet evenings, any of it without her. She listened to all of this. She had her hands clasped in front of her, and she was looking at him with the gray eyes and the careful, deliberate attention. "I have not always been easy to live with," she said. "I have opinions about most things, and I am not good at pretending otherwise. I also become unreasonable when I am very tired, which I told you about in my letter." "I know," he said. "I am asking anyway." "I love you," she said, as though this were a fact she was presenting for his consideration rather than a declaration, but the precision of it made it more weighted rather than less. "I love you in a way that I did not expect to feel again, and I would like very much to marry you." He took both her hands in his, and they stood beside the creek in the November morning, and the water ran over the stones, and the mountains were purple on the horizon, and the moment had the quality of something that had been a long time arriving and had arrived completely. Reverend Adams married them on the second Saturday in December, in the small church that always smelled of pine resin and candle smoke. It was not a large wedding. Colt Hadley stood with Isaiah and was very proud of himself, visibly so, in a way that Isaiah allowed because Colt had, in the end, contributed meaningfully to the outcome and deserved some proportion of the satisfaction he was feeling. Rosa Torres stood with Effie and cried quietly during the vows, which she said afterward was because she was happy, and it was clear that she was. Mrs. Alderman sat in the front row and watched the whole proceeding with the expression of someone who had seen a great many things in 81 years and considered this one of the better ones. Hattie Drummond attended and wept openly, and told everyone within earshot that she had known from the moment she handed Isaiah that first letter that something important was happening. Everyone present understood this to be an adjustment of the historical record, but nobody said so because Hattie was Hattie, and there was no percentage in contradicting her. Abe and Rosa Torres had made food in extraordinary quantities. There was a table under the bare December sky outside the church that held more food than Redemption Creek's 214 residents could have eaten in 2 sittings, and a significant proportion of the town came by over the course of the afternoon and ate and talked, and in the case of several of the older men, told Isaiah how fortunate he was until he agreed wholeheartedly, and with a sincerity that surprised them. Delbert Cross did not attend, which was not surprising, and was not missed, which perhaps said something about the difference between a man with expensive boots and a man who showed up. That evening, when the last guests had gone and the cleanup was done, Isaiah and Effie sat on the bench outside the cabin and looked at the stars. There was no moon, and the stars were enormous, the kind of stars that look like they are competing for attention. The desert was cold and quiet. Biscuit lay at their feet and breathed the slow, contented breathing of an old dog. Effie was leaning against his shoulder and his arm was around her, and there was between them the particular warmth of 2 people who have found a place they intend to stay. "I want to write to my sister," she said, "to tell her she was wrong." "What did she say when you left?" "She said I was being reckless and foolish, and that no respectable man would want a 31-year-old schoolteacher from Grafton who had never learned to be fashionable." Isaiah looked at the stars. "Write her a good letter," he said. "I intend to," Effie said. "I am quite good at letters." "I know," he said. "I have 2 of them." She laughed, and he felt the laugh against his shoulder. Winter came to the Arizona Territory in the particular way that winter comes to the desert, not with snow in Redemption Creek itself, but with cold that sharpened the mornings to a brilliant clarity and turned the evenings into something that demanded a fire and proximity. The cabin was small, but Effie had already begun making it more itself. A woven rug she had sent for from a catalog in the front room, extra blankets, a new curtain on the window Isaiah had cut for her. Small changes that accumulated into the feeling of a home that was inhabited rather than simply occupied. She kept teaching. The school ran from Monday through Friday, and she ran it with a combination of warmth and rigor that produced, within 2 months of her arrival, measurable improvements in what the children of Redemption Creek knew and could do. Lucia Torres, Abe and Rose's daughter, was reading above her age level, and had decided that Latin was the best language, and that she was going to learn it completely, which Effie supported with the full enthusiasm of a woman who had always believed Latin was underestimated. Sam Whitmore, the boy Isaiah had found crying in the classroom, had become one of her most diligent students. He came early sometimes before the other children, and she let him help prepare the room for the day. His father, a quiet man named Gerald Whitmore, stopped by the schoolhouse once to speak to Effie and came out looking as though something in him had been rearranged into a less painful configuration. Isaiah's cattle operation grew in the winter, because he had time now to manage it with more consistent attention, and because Effie, who did not have any particular background in cattle ranching but had a quick, analytical mind for systems, had looked at his approach to the seasonal management of the herd and made several practical suggestions that he tried and found worked. She did not say, "I told you so," when they did. She just moved on to the next thing. The vegetable garden, which had been a running failure for years, was completely restructured in the spring under her direction and produced, to Isaiah's genuine amazement, more than they could eat. Rosa Torres taught Effie how to preserve things in the particular way that worked in the heat of an Arizona summer, and the shelves above the stove, the ones Isaiah had built before she arrived, held more variety and color by summer than they had ever held in the years he had lived alone. In the spring of 1890, Effie told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning before school, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and her hands around it, and the early light coming through both windows. She told him plainly, in the way she did everything, with a directness that made room for the thing to be exactly what it was without ceremony or cushion. He sat across from her and looked at her and did not say anything for a moment. He was thinking about Thomas, the son who had not lived, and Clara, and the grief that had sent him to Arizona. He was thinking about all the space that the intervening years had put between that loss and this morning. He was thinking that grief does change, the way Effie had told Sam Whitmore it changes, and that he was carrying it differently now, and that differently meant he could carry other things. "Effie," he said. "I know," she said, looking at him with gray eyes that understood the weight of the history he was sitting with. "I know what you are thinking about." "I'm thinking that I am very happy," he said, "and that the two things can be true at the same time." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Yes," she said. "They can." She went to school that day and did not tell anyone else yet, because she was Effie and she did not treat her private life as public information until she was ready to. And Isaiah did not tell anyone either, and they carried it between them for a few weeks like something precious that they were not yet ready to share. When she told Rosa Torres, Rosa cried again, which was becoming a recurring feature of her relationship with Effie, and which Effie received with genuine warmth rather than the slight discomfort she might have felt in another context, because she had come to understand that Rosa Torres cried when she was happy as fluently as some people laughed. Colt Hadley, when Isaiah told him on a Sunday at cards, put down his hand and looked at Isaiah across the table with an expression of such complete and unironic sincerity that Isaiah felt it was worth documenting somewhere. "I am genuinely glad," Colt said. "I want you to know I'm not just glad because I set the whole thing in motion. I'm glad because you deserve this." "You set one letter in motion," Isaiah said. "She set everything else in motion herself." "She did," Colt agreed. She is remarkable. She is, Isaiah said. You should play your hand, Colt said, gesturing at the cards, and then admit that I did you an enormous favor. Deal the next round, Isaiah said. Summer in Arizona was fierce and consistent. The heat was not gentle, and Effie met it with the practical adaptation of a woman who had learned in her first summer here that fighting the climate was a waste of energy better directed elsewhere. She wore lighter clothes and drank more water, and adjusted the school schedule so the hardest work happened in the early hours and the afternoons were quieter. She was not a woman who complained about things that were structural to the situation. She saved her energy for things that could be changed. Her pregnancy showed by August, and Redemption Creek's 214 residents received this information with the warmth of a community that had made Effie Carver Granger one of its own in the months since her arrival. She received more food than two people could consume. Mrs. Alderman came back to teach a half-day 3 times a week so that Effie could rest, and did so with the air of someone performing a critical civic service and expecting no thanks, though she clearly appreciated the thanks she received. In September of 1890, exactly 1 year after she had arrived on the train platform in Tucson with a brown leather satchel and a heavy carpet bag, Effie delivered a son. It was a long labor. The midwife, a steady woman named Clara who had been delivering babies in the Arizona Territory for 20 years, managed the whole proceeding with calm competence, and Isaiah was present in the way that a man can be present when he is trying very hard to be useful, and is aware that the actual work is not his to do. He held Effie's hand when she let him hold it and moved away when she wanted space, and said nothing when there was nothing useful to say, which was most of the time. The boy arrived in the early morning, filling the cabin with the first sound that newborns make, that particular initial announcement that the world has acquired a new occupant. Isaiah held his son for the first time in the blue-gray light of a September morning, and he was aware of the weight of everything that moment contained, the loss that had preceded it and the love that had led to it and the small face of this new person who was entirely his own. "He's perfect," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. Effie was watching him from the bed with gray eyes that were exhausted and luminous. "What shall we call him?" she asked. They had discussed names. They had considered several. But in the moment, holding this particular boy, the answer was the one he had carried with him from Kansas for 7 years. "Thomas," he said, "if you agree." She was quiet for a moment. She understood exactly what was in that name. "Thomas," she said. "Yes, that is right." He carried Thomas to the window and stood in the early light and showed his son the desert, the pale gold scrub and the distant purple mountains and the enormous Arizona sky going from gray to rose as the sun came up, and he thought that this was the world his son would learn, this big, difficult, beautiful world, and that he would not be learning it alone. Mrs. Alderman came to see Thomas and declared him an excellent specimen, and showed no particular softness in doing so, which everyone understood to be her form of highest praise. Colt Hadley held him with the careful, slightly terrified expression that large men adopt when given infants, and said he was good-looking, and meant it as a compliment to both parents. Rosa Torres held him, and said in Spanish several things that Effie, who had begun learning some Spanish in the month since arriving, understood to be blessings. Hattie Drummond told everyone in town that she had somehow known, from the beginning, that the correspondence she had handled was going to result in a baby, which was a piece of historical revisionism so bold that it deserved, in its own way, a kind of admiration. The months after Thomas's birth arranged themselves into the particular fullness of a household that has added a third person. All the adjustments and discoveries and moments of exhaustion and moments of such clear joy that they balance everything else, and then some. Effie returned to teaching in November when Thomas was 6 weeks old, bringing him with her to the school and installing a small basket near her desk in which he slept while she taught, supervised by a rotating group of older students who took this responsibility with great seriousness. Lucia Torres, now 12 and deeply invested in both Latin and in Thomas Granger, was his most attentive supervisor and held him with the confident authority of a girl who had decided she was competent and had subsequently become so. Isaiah ran the homestead and the cattle and rode into town most afternoons to collect his wife and son and walk or drive them home through the warm Arizona evenings. They had fallen into the particular rhythm of two people who have built a life together and who move through it with the ease of genuine partnership, which is not the same as everything being easy, but means that the difficult things are faced in the same direction. The Eastern pasture trouble with Delbert Cross resolved itself in the spring of 1891 in the most satisfying possible way, which was that Cross's son Miles made a series of spectacularly bad decisions in Tucson that required Cross Bar Ranch to sell 200 acres of land to cover the resulting debts, and the question of acquiring Isaiah's eastern pasture was no longer relevant to anyone. Cross did not come into Redemption Creek often after that. When he did not speak to either of the Grangers, and they did not require him to. Gerald Whitmore, Sam's father, had by this point become something like a friend of the homestead in the particular way of a widowed man who needs connection without having to ask for it directly. He came for Sunday dinners occasionally, and his boy Sam came with him, and Sam had begun to thrive in a way that was visible and gratifying, a boy finding his footing in the world with the help of a teacher who told him the truth about hard things. Thomas grew. All babies grow, but Thomas grew with the particular vigor of a child born into a home full of love and useful work and honest conversation, and he was an interested, bright-eyed boy who seemed to find everything around him worth investigating. He sat in the vegetable garden in the mornings when Effie worked in it and filled his hands with good Arizona dirt and considered it seriously. He rode in the wagon with his father on the runs to check fence lines, and looked at the desert with the attentive gaze of someone accumulating information about a world he intended to know well. He began talking with the enthusiastic imprecision of a 2-year-old, and his first clear word was neither mama nor papa, but was, by everyone's witness, dog, directed with triumphant clarity at Biscuit, who looked up from the floor and then looked back down again with the philosophical acceptance of an elderly animal who had learned not to expect too much from moments of apparent significance. Biscuit died in the autumn of 1892, peacefully on his rug by the fire, and Isaiah buried him in the yard by the garden, and Thomas, 3 years old, put a flat stone on the grave and patted it solemnly, and Effie stood beside them both with her hand in Isaiah's, and did not say that it was only a dog, because she understood that some things are exactly as important as they feel and deserve to be treated accordingly. In the spring of 1893, Effie told Isaiah she was expecting their second child, and this time the telling was different, easier. The knowledge carried between two people who knew by now what they were doing, and who trusted each other completely with all the weight that life contained. She was 35, which she mentioned with the practical awareness of a woman who dealt in facts, and Isaiah was 38, and they were both people who knew that age was not a reason to decline the good things. The second child was a girl, born in the October heat of a late-season afternoon, and she arrived with an efficiency that the midwife Clara said was the fastest she had managed in this county for some time. She was dark-haired like her mother and looked out at the world from the very first with the same direct, gray-eyed attention that Effie brought to everything. "What do you think?" Isaiah asked, holding her while Effie rested. "Clara," Effie said, without hesitation. He looked at her. She looked back. "Is that all right?" she asked. He looked at the baby in his arms, this small girl with her mother's eyes and her quiet, attentive regard. "It is more than all right," he said. "It is exactly right." Thomas, 3 years old, was introduced to his sister with the sober formality of a boy who understood something significant was happening and wanted to behave accordingly. He looked at Clara for a long time in the careful way that a child examines something entirely new, and then he said in his clear, small voice that she was small, which was accurate, and that she could share his toy horse, which was, as everyone in the room understood, a significant offer from a 3-year-old boy. The school continued to be Effie's. Mrs. Alderman, now 86, came by occasionally and observed, and offered comments that Effie received with the deference she gave to genuine knowledge. And the children of Redemption Creek grew up knowing how to read and calculate, and think about history with something approaching accuracy, which was more than could be said for many towns of similar size in the Arizona Territory in 1893. Lucia Torres, 14 and remarkable, was reading Cicero in the original Latin, and had begun to teach her younger siblings with the proprietary enthusiasm of someone who has discovered something they intend to share widely. Rosa Torres told Effie that whatever happened to Lucia in her life, it would include more than anyone had expected, and Effie said that was as it should be, and meant it. Isaiah expanded the cattle operation in 1893 and again in 1894, bringing the herd to 42 head and adding a second hired hand, a young man from New Mexico named Daniel who was 19 and hardworking, and who ate supper at the Granger table twice a week, because he was far from home, and Effie Granger's table was the kind of table that expanded to include people who needed it. Colt Hadley, in the meantime, had done something no one had entirely predicted, which was to fall genuinely in love with a woman named Ada Marsh, who came through Redemption Creek on her way to visit her brother in Tucson, and then simply stopped going. Ada Marsh was 33 and had opinions about nearly everything, which meant that she and Effie understood each other immediately and completely, and which meant that Sunday cards became a 4-person game that was considerably more competitive than it had been before. Colt asked Isaiah what he had done to make Effie comfortable enough to stay, what the exact combination of things had been, and Isaiah said, after thinking about it, that the only real answer was that he had not tried to be anything other than what he was, and had not asked her to be anything other than what she was either, and that everything else had followed from that. Colt looked at this answer with the expression of a man confronting something simple that he had been looking past. "Is that it?" he said. "That's it," Isaiah said. Colt married Ada in the spring of 1894 in the same small church with the same reverend, and Isaiah stood with him the way Colt had stood with Isaiah, and Effie stood with Ada, and Thomas Granger, 4 years old, was given the important role of carrying the ring on a small cushion, which he did with the absolute seriousness of a boy who did not take important roles lightly. Redemption Creek grew in those years. Not dramatically, not in the way that some towns grew around mining or railroad stops, but steadily, the way a good thing grows when it is well tended. Families came and established themselves. The general store expanded. A proper doctor arrived in 1894. A man named Henry Parsons, who had trained in St. Louis and come west for his health, and found that the desert agreed with his lungs considerably, and whose presence meant that the community no longer had to ride to Tucson for medical attention in ordinary situations. Effie and Dr. Parsons became something like colleagues in the project of community well-being, which was not a category that would have had a name in most places, but which in Redemption Creek meant that the school and the doctor's office coordinated on matters of children's health and learning with a thoroughness that benefited everyone concerned. Mrs. Alderman died in the winter of 1895 at the age of 88, in her sleep, which was the right kind of ending for a woman who had spent 60 years being forceful during waking hours. Her funeral was attended by a very great number of people, including several who were now adults and had been her students, and who came from considerable distances to be there. Effie delivered the memorial address in the church, and she spoke about Mrs. Alderman with the honest precision that she had always used to speak about everything, and what she said was that here was a woman who had decided what she was for, and then done it completely, for 60 years, without apology, and that this was not a small thing. This was in fact about as large a thing as a person could do with a life. There was not a dry eye in the church, though several of the older men in the back pews were clearly attempting to maintain this appearance. In the spring of 1896, Thomas started school. He walked into his mother's classroom on his first day with the slightly complex expression of a boy who knows the teacher personally and is trying to decide how this fact should be handled in a social context. And Effie looked at him from the front of the room and said, "Good morning, Mr. Granger," in exactly the same tone she used with every other student, which settled the question neatly, and Thomas took his seat and got to work. He was, his mother noted in the private journal she kept with the unsentimental precision she applied to everything, a boy with a good ear for language and a weakness for arithmetic that they would need to address directly. She addressed it directly. By the end of the year, his arithmetic was not a weakness. Clara, 2 years younger, was already trying to read, having apparently absorbed from the household air the general understanding that reading was a thing one did, and had demanded at 3 years old that her father read to her every evening from whatever was available, and Isaiah had complied with the pleasure of a man who had not read aloud in years and had missed it without knowing it. The homestead had become, by the middle 1890s, a genuinely working enterprise that supported the family without the constant anxiety that had characterized the early years. The garden produced. The cattle were healthy. The second hired hand, Daniel, had learned the land so well that he could manage a good deal of the operations independently, and Isaiah had the time to think about the next year and the year after that, which was a different kind of thinking than surviving the current season. He stood in the yard one evening in the summer of 1896 when the heat had broken and the stars were out, and the desert was dark and fragrant with whatever the desert smells of in the summer evenings, which is a thing that cannot be named, but which anyone who has stood in the Arizona territory at night knows is real. He stood there and held the two things that lived inside him, the grief of what he had lost and the fullness of what he had found, and he understood with the certainty of a man who has had time to think clearly that they were not in opposition. That Clara and Thomas, the first Thomas, had always been part of this story, were part of this life even now, because the loss of them had brought him here, and here had given him Effie, and Effie had given him everything that followed. He heard the door open behind him and felt her before she spoke, her hand finding his in the dark. "Come inside," she said. "Clara woke up and she will not go back to sleep unless her father reads to her." "She is going to be trouble," he said. "She is already trouble," Effie said, with profound satisfaction. "She is exactly like me." He turned and looked at her in the starlight, this woman with her plain face and her gray eyes and her strong hands and her quick temper that she governed better now than she had managed in Missouri, though she would be the first to say that governance was still an ongoing project. He kissed her in the starlight and she kissed him back, fully and honestly and without reservation, in the way she had always done everything. "Come inside," she said again. "Your daughter is waiting." He followed her into the lighted warmth of the cabin, into the smell of the stove and the honey from Patel's bees, and the indefinable smell of a house inhabited by people who love each other. And he sat in the chair by Clara's small bed, and opened the book and read aloud in the desert night, while his daughter lay with her dark hair spread on the pillow and her gray eyes at half-mast, and the lamp light made warm circles on the walls. And Effie sat across the room in the other chair with her own book and her feet tucked up, and Thomas could be heard breathing the deep, regular breathing of a child already asleep in the next room. Outside, the desert stretched to the mountains, and the stars were in their places, and the creek ran quiet over its stones, and Redemption Creek settled into another night. And Isaiah Granger read until Clara's eyes closed, and then he sat in the quiet and looked at his wife across the room, and she looked up and met his eyes over the top of her book, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. The years moved forward the way good years do, not in straight lines but in the particular generous arc of a life that is fully lived. They had their arguments, because Effie had a quick temper and Isaiah had a stubbornness that he would not entirely claim to. And two people with strong characters living in close quarters will always find the precise points where their characters chafe against each other. But they had always been honest with each other, from the very first letter. And honesty in an argument means that the argument is about the actual thing rather than the historical accumulation of grievances dressed up as the current thing. And so their arguments resolved, and they moved on. And the moving on was genuine rather than the kind that simply covers something over. Thomas grew into a tall, serious boy with his father's shoulders and his mother's precision of thought, who showed an early aptitude for the land and an unexpected gift for Latin that delighted Effie beyond her ability to conceal it. Clara grew into a girl who was, as predicted, trouble of the most splendid variety, with opinions that she expressed loudly and a laugh that filled whatever room she was in, and an absolute conviction that everything was worth trying at least once, including, at 9 years old, attempting to teach Lucia Torres' younger brother Pablo to read in 3 languages simultaneously, which was ambitious to the point of being impractical, but which she pursued with complete commitment. Colt and Ada Hadley had 2 children of their own, a boy named James and a girl named Ruth, and the 2 families were so intertwined by 1898 that the children moved between the homesteads as though the 2 were one large household that happened to be divided by 3 miles of desert. The town changed around them as the century turned. The railroad brought more people. The mining operations to the south brought workers and families. Redemption Creek in 1900 was not the town of 214 that Effie had arrived in 11 years earlier, but it was still a town with a school and a church and a general store and a post office and a blacksmith and a creek and people who knew each other's names and business, which was not nothing, which was in fact a considerable amount. Hattie Drummond was still running the post office in 1900 and was still claiming, with magnificent consistency, to never read other people's correspondence, and was still the first person in town to know everything that was in it. She was older now but no less sharp, and she handled the mail for a town twice its former size with the same possessive thoroughness she had always brought to the task. One morning in January of 1900, a day that was cold and bright in the way that January in Arizona is cold and bright, Effie found herself standing at the window of the schoolroom before the children arrived, looking out at the main street of Redemption Creek with the particular feeling of a woman who has arrived somewhere and knows she has arrived. She was 42 years old. She was a teacher and a rancher's wife, and a mother, and a friend to people she had not known 11 years ago, and could not now imagine life without. She had strong hands and gray eyes, and a face that was exactly as she had described it in a letter to a stranger in 1889, plain in the way that honest things are plain, with nothing hidden and nothing performed. She had written that letter thinking it might end things before they began. She had written it because if Isaiah Granger was going to want her, she needed him to want the true version, and the true version included brown hair and gray eyes and a quick temper, and 41 total years of life before she had ever set foot in Arizona. She had thought the honesty might cost her the chance. Instead, it had been the very thing that made him write back 3 pages. She was thinking about this when she heard his boots on the schoolhouse step, the familiar tread she could have identified in a crowd by this point, and the door opened and Isaiah came in with a cup of coffee because she had left without hers in the rush to get Thomas and Clara moving that morning. He put the cup on the edge of her desk and looked at her by the window. "You have that look," he said. "What look?" "The one where you are thinking about something and have reached a conclusion about it." She looked at him, this man who was 44 now and gray at the temples and weathered in a way that made him look like he belonged to the landscape he had worked, and who had known from the beginning how to be exactly what he was. I was thinking, she said, that it was a good letter. He looked at her for a moment. Which one? The first one, she said. The one you wrote back to me when I told you I was old and plain. You were 31, he said. I was warning you. I know, he said. I ignored the warning. You wrote 3 pages, she said. They were all good pages. So were yours, he said. She picked up the coffee cup and wrapped both hands around it and looked at him in the winter morning light of the schoolroom, where she had spent 11 years teaching the children of Redemption Creek to think and read and question, and know the world clearly. Outside the window, the street was waking up. Inside the cabin 3 miles away, Thomas and Clara were presumably getting themselves ready for school with the approximate efficiency of children who had been told twice and would likely need telling once more. Isaiah, she said, yes. I want you to know, she said, that I was not desperate when I came here. I want you to know that I came because I chose to. Because you were worth choosing. He looked at her across the schoolroom in the January morning, this woman who had written him an honest letter that warned him away from her, and he had read it and driven 4 hours through the desert to collect her from a train platform because the letter itself had been the best argument for her he could have imagined. I know, he said. I have always known that. She nodded, because this was exactly the right answer and she had expected nothing less, and because in 11 years he had not once given her a reason to doubt it. The children began to arrive. First through the door was Pablo Torres, 8 years old, carrying his slate and the slightly harassed expression of a boy who had been competing with his sister for a seat on the schoolhouse steps. Behind him came Sam Whitmore's little sister June, who had started this year and was 7 and very earnest about everything. And behind her, Thomas and Clara Granger, her own 2, Thomas with his slate under his arm and Clara talking at full speed about something she had seen on the walk to school that had struck her as requiring immediate commentary. Effie put down her coffee cup and stepped to the front of the room and said, "Good morning," in the voice she used for school, clear and warm and carrying the absolute conviction that what happened in this room mattered. And the morning began. That evening, Isaiah and Effie Granger walked home from the schoolhouse together in the low gold light of a January afternoon, Thomas walking ahead of them with the long stride of a boy who was almost 11 and thought he should be allowed to be faster than the adults, and Clara walking between her parents with a hand in each of theirs, and talking continuously about a wide variety of subjects that ranged from what she wanted to name the 2 new calves to her considered opinion that Pablo Torres should not be allowed to sit next to James Hadley, because together they were unreasonably distracted from serious work. The desert was pale gold around them. The mountains were purple in the last of the daylight. The sky above the mountains was the color it turned every evening, that burning, unnamed color that lived at the edge between orange and rose, and above that the soft darkening that was the coming of the Arizona night. Isaiah looked at Effie walking beside him with Clara's hand in hers and the evening light on her face, this plain, strong, honest, remarkable face, and felt the full weight of gratitude for a Tuesday long ago when a letter arrived from Missouri. She looked up and caught him looking. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was just looking." She looked at him for a moment with her gray eyes, and then she looked back at the sunset, at the burning colors over the desert that she had seen every evening for 11 years and which she had still, not once, taken for granted. "It is a good one tonight," she said. "It always is," he agreed. Clara tugged on both their hands. "Are we stopping? Why are we stopping? I am hungry." "We are not stopping," Effie said. "We are walking and looking at the same time. You can do 2 things at once. I have been teaching you this for 9 years. I can do 3 things at once," Clara said, with the confidence of a girl who had never doubted this. "I am walking and looking and talking." "This is accurate," Isaiah said. "So can we have something good for supper?" Clara asked. "Yes," Effie said. "And can I name the calves? We will discuss it." "That means yes," Clara informed her brother, who had circled back when they stopped and was now walking beside his father with his hands in his pockets and the expression of an almost 11-year-old who had learned to let his sister's enthusiasm move around him like water around a stone. He caught his father's eye with the sideways glance of a boy who had grown up watching his parents and had absorbed, in the wordless way children absorb the essential truths of the households they grow up in, that the man walking beside him and the woman on the other side of Clara were people who had chosen each other honestly and kept choosing each other every day since. Thomas looked at the sunset. "It really is a good one tonight," he said. "Yes," his father said. They walked home through the Arizona evening, the four of them, and the stars came out above them one by one the way stars do, gradually and then all at once, and the cabin ahead had its light in the window, warm and waiting, and Biscuit's successor, a young brown dog named Honey who had arrived 2 years ago and had none of Biscuit's philosophically resignation and all of his loyalty, came bounding out of the barn to meet them. And Clara let go of both their hands to run ahead, and Thomas broke into an easy lope to keep up with her. And Isaiah and Effie walked the last stretch through the cool January air in the settled, complete quiet of two people who have built a life together with their hands and their honesty and their willingness to be exactly what they are. The homestead held them. The desert held them. The stars held them. And the night came down over Redemption Creek like a blessing, deep and quiet, and full of the particular peace that belongs to people who have found their place in the world and know it, and chose it, and mean to stay.